Was I really her? Rita Hayworth couldn't remember being the world's most famous woman. Alzheimer's was erasing both identities. 5 other Golden Age legends wrote letters that could have ended their careers. One was condemned by the Senate. One wrote goodbye before combat. One predicted her comeback. One defeated McCarthy, and one admitted he faked it all. Ingrid Bergman, letters written while America hated her. They want me to apologize for loving. I won't. If that makes me evil, then Hollywood and I were never meant for each other. Ingrid Bergman wrote those words in 1950 from a small apartment in Rome, pregnant, exiled, and publicly denounced by a United States senator as a powerful influence for evil. She'd been America's saint, literally playing Joan of Arc on screen. Now she was being called the devil for falling in love. The year was 1949, and Bergman had just conquered Hollywood. She'd made audiences weep in Casablanca, where her performance opposite Humphrey Bogart became the standard for screen romance. She'd portrayed a literal saint in Joan of Arc. Magazines called her the most beautiful woman in the world. Churches held her up as proof that movies could be both successful and wholesome. Then, in an instant, it all shattered. Bergman fell in love with Italian director Roberto Rossellini while filming Stromboli. There was just one problem. She was married to Dr. Peter Lindstrom back in California with a 10-year-old daughter named Pia. When news broke that she was leaving her family for Rossellini, who was also married, America felt personally betrayed. Columnists called her every name imaginable. Hedda Hopper wrote that Bergman had deceived the American public. Churches denounced her from pulpits. Women's groups organized boycotts. Her films were yanked from theaters mid-run, but nothing compared to what happened on March 14, 1950, when Senator Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado took to the floor of the United States Senate and delivered a speech specifically denouncing Ingrid Bergman, not a criminal, not a traitor, an actress who'd fallen in love. He called her a powerful influence for evil and Hollywood's apostle of degradation. He demanded she be barred from ever working in American films again. This was unprecedented. A United States senator using the power of his office to destroy a woman for her personal life. Bergman fled to Italy, 5 months pregnant with Rossellini's child, living in a cramped apartment, completely cut off from Hollywood. Her money was frozen in legal battles. Her daughter was an ocean away. She'd wake up each morning to bags of mail delivered by confused Italian postal workers. Hundreds of letters calling her terrible things, wishing violence upon her and her unborn child. She'd cry herself to sleep in a foreign country where she barely spoke the language, wake to more hate mail, then sit down at a small wooden desk and write defiant letters to strangers, because scattered among the poison were other letters, fans who refused to abandon her. And Bergman, alone in her exile, grabbed her pen and wrote back to every single one of them. Her letters reveal a woman in tremendous pain, but absolutely unbowed. She described the isolation of being pregnant, while America called her unfit. She wrote about her daughter Pia being told by strangers that her mother was evil. She wrote about the guilt, had she been selfish? But then she'd write about Roberto, about finally feeling understood, about feeling alive for the first time in years. The morning after the Senate speech, she sat at her desk with shaking hands. She described them trembling so badly she could barely hold the pen, and wrote to 7 different fans, each letter longer than the last, pouring out her defiance. To one fan in Ohio who'd written a supportive letter, Bergman replied, "They want me to apologize for loving. I won't. If that makes me evil, then Hollywood and I were never meant for each other." She explained that pretending to be happy in a loveless marriage would have been the real sin. She wrote about choosing authenticity over image, even if it cost her everything. The letters show her questioning everything. What did it mean that a senator had used government power to attack her? She wrote about the hypocrisy. Male stars had affairs constantly, left their families, and no one called them evil. Clark Gable had cheated on multiple wives. Spencer Tracy lived openly with Katharine Hepburn while married to someone else. But because she was a woman, because she'd played Joan of Arc, her humanity was unforgivable. For 7 years, Bergman lived in European exile, making films with Rossellini that Americans never saw. She gave birth to her son, Robertino, in February 1950, 3 weeks after the Senate speech. She wrote about holding her newborn and wondering if he'd ever see America. She kept fans updated on her life, her children. She had twin daughters in 1952, her refusal to beg Hollywood for forgiveness. And slowly, something shifted. Time passed. The hysteria cooled. People began questioning whether the punishment had fit the crime. In 1956, Bergman was offered the lead role in Anastasia. When the film opened in America, audiences packed theaters. They'd missed her. When she won the Academy Award for Best Actress on Easter Sunday 1957, she received a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. America had forgiven her, or perhaps more accurately, America had realized it had been wrong. Bergman eventually divorced Rossellini. That relationship ended too, proof that following your heart doesn't guarantee happiness, just authenticity. She worked in Hollywood again, won 2 more Oscars, and lived until 1982. In her final autobiography, she wrote about those letters from exile, about how the fans who stood by her gave her the strength to refuse to grovel. She had been right. Love wasn't a crime, and history vindicated her completely. James Stewart, letters written hours before nearly passing away in combat. Ingrid Bergman chose love and survived the consequences, but what James Stewart chose nearly ended his life, and he volunteered for it. Why would the most beloved man in America fight his way into the most dangerous job in the war? The answer is in letters he wrote the night before. He thought he wouldn't come home. James Stewart was 33 years old in 1943, at the absolute peak of his career. He'd given America Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the film that made him a star and defined what it meant to be a decent man, standing up to corruption. He'd won an Oscar for The Philadelphia Story. He was the actor who made you believe in goodness. Then he walked away from millions of dollars and walked into war. Stewart enlisted in the Army Air Corps in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. He didn't have to. He was 33, well over draft age. He could have made training films, sold war bonds, entertained troops safely behind the lines. But Stewart had been a pilot since college. He wanted to fly combat missions. The military initially refused. He was too famous, too valuable for morale. If Jimmy Stewart got shot down over Germany, American morale might shatter. Better to keep him safe, keep him selling the war to people back home. Stewart fought back with the same stubbornness he'd shown in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He was underweight for military requirements, so he spent weeks eating constantly to gain the necessary pounds. He pulled strings through his father, a World War I veteran. He wrote letters to commanders. Finally, they relented and sent him to England as a bomber pilot. But even then, they kept him from actual combat. Stewart went over their heads until finally, in late 1943, they let him fly combat missions over Europe. He flew 20 bombing runs over Germany in a B-24 Liberator, one of the most dangerous assignments in the war. These weren't glamorous fighter-pilot missions. These were missions deep into Nazi territory, with a crew of 10 men flying massive, slow bombers through walls of anti-aircraft fire, through swarms of German fighters. The B-24 had a reputation. Crews called it the flying coffin. He rose to squadron commander, meaning he wasn't just risking his own life. He was ordering other young men into situations where they might not come back. Men he'd eaten breakfast with. The stress was unimaginable. Between missions, when other pilots were drinking themselves numb, Stewart wrote letters. He wrote to his father, Alexander Stewart, a World War I veteran who understood what his son was going through. He wrote to friends back in California, and he wrote to fans who'd sent letters asking if he was okay, begging him to come home safely. These letters reveal a man utterly transformed from his screen image. Stewart wrote about fear, real, overwhelming, physical fear. He described the moment before each mission when his hands would shake so badly he could barely grip the controls, when his crew chief would have to help him into the cockpit because his legs wouldn't hold him. He wrote about the smell, burning metal and aviation fuel that he could taste for hours after missions that would wake him up at night. He wrote about watching planes in his formation get hit, watching them explode in balls of orange flame or spiral down trailing black smoke, knowing there were men inside, men he'd eaten breakfast with that morning. In one letter, he described watching a B-24 take a direct hit and simply disintegrate. No parachutes, no survivors, just gone. In another letter, he described how after particularly rough missions, his hands would be locked on the controls when they finally landed, muscles frozen by fear and adrenaline, and the crew chief had to physically pry his fingers open. He told one mother whose son was also flying that he prayed before every mission, not for survival, but for courage not to turn the plane around. He questioned whether he was cut out for command. In one letter, he confessed his terror that his orders were sending men to unnecessary danger, that he was making tactical mistakes that cost lives. He wasn't a career military man. He was an actor playing commander, and the stakes were human lives. In one letter to a school teacher in Nebraska, written the night before a particularly dangerous mission to Brunswick, Germany. Stewart described saying goodbye to his personal effects. He wrote out his final thoughts. Who should get what if he didn't come back? The letter ends with a line that still brings chills. Tomorrow we fly again. I don't know if I'm coming back. If I don't, tell everyone that making them smile was the best thing I ever did. That mattered. And if this is the price for having had that privilege, then I accept it. The next day, Stewart's bomber was hit by anti-aircraft fire over the target. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. One engine caught fire. They lost altitude. Wounded crew members bled in the back while Stewart fought the controls, coaxing a crippled bomber back toward England on 3 engines. They barely made it back, crash landing on the first airfield they could reach. Stewart survived, but barely. He flew more missions after that, 20 total before his tour ended. Each one aged him. Photographs from early in his service show the boyish Jimmy Stewart. Photographs from late 1944 show a gaunt, haunted man. When he returned to Hollywood in 1945, he was a changed man. Friends said he rarely smiled anymore. He suffered what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares that had him waking up screaming about men burning alive in planes he'd ordered into the sky. He never played light comedy the same way again. His post-war roles had an edge, a darkness that hadn't been there before. Watch It's a Wonderful Life, and you can see it. George Bailey's desperation is real because Stewart had stared into similar darkness. Stewart never glorified war. When reporters asked about his service, he deflected. When Hollywood wanted to make him out to be a hero, he refused. He'd say the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. For the rest of his life, he lived until 1997. He maintained relationships with the families of men who'd served under him, attending funerals decades later, writing letters of condolence, carrying that burden of command. The letters he wrote from England show a man confronting mortality in the most visceral way possible. Not movie endings where the hero falls dramatically. Real endings. Young men burning alive, screaming over the radio, gone. And through it all, Stewart maintained his humility, his belief that entertaining people mattered. He risked everything because he believed some things were worth fighting for. And he came back forever changed. Before you hear our next story, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button, because what we're about to reveal about Bette Davis will change everything you thought you knew about Hollywood comebacks. Bette Davis, Letters from the Wilderness, years that predicted her comeback. Stewart came home from war a hero, forever changed but honored. Bette Davis came home from the Oscars and couldn't get a phone call returned. At 40, Hollywood told her she was done. Yesterday's news. What she did next wasn't begging. It was preparation, and it led to one of the greatest comebacks in cinema history. 1948. Bette Davis was 40 years old, and in Hollywood, that might as well have been 80. She'd been one of the biggest stars in the world throughout the 1930s and early 40s. She'd made women weep in dark victory, playing a socialite facing mortality with courage. She'd made them strong in Now Voyager, with that iconic line, "Don't ask for the moon, we have the stars." She'd won 2 Academy Awards for Dangerous and Jezebel. She'd fought Warner Brothers in court for better roles, for control over her career, and won concessions that no other actress had dared demand. She'd been fierce, uncompromising, brilliant, difficult in all the best ways. And now, no one would hire her. Not a single offer worth considering. The previous year, theater owners had published a list of stars they considered box office poison, actors whose names no longer sold tickets. The list included Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, and Katharine Hepburn, 3 of the most talented actresses in Hollywood history. Women who'd defined what movie acting could be were dismissed as unmarketable in a single cruel sentence in a trade publication. Warner Brothers dropped Davis's contract after 18 years of making them fortunes. Studios stopped returning her agent's calls. Scripts that would have been offered to her automatically 5 years earlier now went to younger actresses. Davis lived off her savings in a house in Laguna Beach, a beach town south of Los Angeles, watching the Pacific Ocean and watching her career evaporate in slow motion. She'd pick up Variety or The Hollywood Reporter and see younger actresses, Jennifer Jones, who was 29, Olivia de Havilland, who was 32, getting the roles she should have been offered, playing the complex, difficult women she'd spent decades proving audiences wanted to see. She'd read about their salaries, their contracts, their futures, and know that Hollywood had decided she no longer had one. She could have done theater. Broadway would have cast her in a heartbeat. She could have retired. She had money saved, investments, a comfortable life ahead. She could have accepted that Hollywood was done with her, that 40 years old meant the end for women, even as men like Humphrey Bogart, James Cagney, Spencer Tracy, all her exact contemporaries, all in their late 40s or 50s, were still getting lead roles, still playing romantic heroes opposite women 30 years younger, still considered bankable stars. Instead, she did something remarkable. She started writing letters to strangers, every piece of fan mail she'd accumulated from her glory days. And there were thousands upon thousands of letters stuffed in boxes in her garage and attic. Letters from women who'd written during the war saying her films got them through dark times. Letters from teenagers who wanted to be actresses. Letters from housewives who saw themselves in her characters. She began responding to personally. Women who'd written years earlier, who'd never received responses because Davis had been too busy making 3 films a year, would suddenly receive a handwritten response from Betty Davis herself, postmarked Laguna Beach, written in her distinctive slanted script on personal stationery. She wrote long letters, several pages each, about dignity, about perseverance, about refusing to be erased simply because Hollywood had decided your expiration date had arrived at 40, to a housewife in Kansas named Margaret Chen who'd written during the war saying, now, Voyager had given her courage to leave an abusive marriage. Davis sent a letter in 1949 that would become famous among those who received her correspondence. They've written me off. I'm writing back. Watch what happens. She described her daily routine, waking at dawn, doing calisthenics to stay in shape even though no one was hiring her, reading scripts that went to other actresses, marking them up with notes about what she would have done differently, maintaining her discipline even though the phone wasn't ringing. She wrote about ageism with a fury that leaps off the page, about how men in their 40s and 50s were still playing romantic leads, were still considered in their prime, while women over 40 were offered mother parts or nothing, grandmother roles or retirement. She wrote that Hollywood would cast a 50-year-old man opposite a 25-year-old woman and call it romantic, but wouldn't cast a 40-year-old woman opposite a 40-year-old man because she was too old. The letters reveal her anger, but also her absolute belief in her own talent, a belief that bordered on arrogance, but was entirely justified. She wrote that talent doesn't expire at 40, that life experience and maturity actually make you a better actor, that some of her best work was still ahead of her if someone would just give her the chance to prove it. She told fans she would rather disappear completely than compromise, than take demeaning roles just to work, then become one of those tragic former stars who accepted anything just to stay visible, just to keep their names in the papers. She would wait for the right role, even if it never came. She would maintain her dignity, even if it meant never working again. But she wasn't waiting passively. She was preparing, staying ready. Day after day, month after month, she'd sit at her desk overlooking the Pacific Ocean and write to strangers. It became her discipline, her purpose, her job when she had no job. Every letter was a small act of defiance against Hollywood's verdict. You haven't forgotten me. I haven't forgotten who I am. I'm still Betty Davis. This isn't over until I say it's over. She wrote about the loneliness of those years, about reading in the trades that younger actresses were being called the new Betty Davis, as if she were already gone, already part of history instead of a living, working actress. She wrote about the financial anxiety. Her savings were substantial, but not infinite, and she was supporting her mother and her sister. She wrote about the humiliation of going to parties and seeing the pity in people's eyes, seeing them wonder when she'd give up. But she also wrote about hope, about stubbornness, about refusing to let them win. In one letter from late 1949, she told a fan, "Every morning I wake up and choose to fight, not because I think I'll win, I have no idea if I will, but because the alternative is accepting that they were right, that I'm finished at 40, and I'd rather fail fighting than succeed at surrendering." And then, in early 1950, after 2 years of wilderness, it came. The script was called All About Eve, written and to be directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz. It was a story about an aging Broadway actress named Margot Channing being supplanted by a younger woman, about the terror of aging in a youth-obsessed industry, about fighting to remain relevant when everyone's telling you your time is over. The role had initially been offered to Claudette Colbert, who was 46, but Colbert broke her back in a skiing accident and had to withdraw. Davis's agent, who hadn't had good news to deliver in 2 years, got her the audition. Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz was skeptical. He'd heard Davis was difficult, temperamental, past her prime, box office poison. He'd heard she'd fight with directors, that she'd try to control every aspect of production. Then she read for him. Davis later wrote to a fan that she knew within 5 minutes of that audition that she'd won the role. She understood Margot Channing on a cellular level, in her bones, in her soul. Margot's fear of aging, her fury at being dismissed, her desperate attempt to hold on to relevance while younger women circled. Davis had been living it for 3 years, every morning waking up wondering if she'd ever work again. She poured everything into that audition, every ounce of rage and terror and defiance she'd felt during those wilderness years. She gave Mankiewicz a performance that was searing, funny, tragic. He gave her the part on the spot. All About Eve became one of the greatest films in Hollywood history. Davis's performance is a masterclass in screen acting. Watching her light a cigarette while delivering the line, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night," is watching an actress who refused to disappear, who took all her pain and anger and channeled it into something magnificent. She received her 8th Academy Award nomination. The film was nominated for 14 Oscars, a record at the time, winning 6, including Best Picture. And just like that, with one performance, Bette Davis was back from the grave Hollywood had dug for her. She worked for another 40 years after All About Eve. She made incredible films. The Star, where she played a washed-up actress and got another Oscar nomination. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, where she finally worked with her old rival Joan Crawford. The Nanny, Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte. She worked until a few years before passing away in 1989 at age 81. The woman Hollywood had written off at 40 worked for 4 more decades and never apologized for being difficult. Difficult meant demanding excellence. Difficult meant refusing to settle. In later interviews, Davis credited those fan letters with saving her sanity during the wilderness years. Writing to women who believed in her gave her a reason to maintain her discipline, to stay ready. She said the fans who wrote back reminded her that she mattered beyond box office receipts. She taught a generation of actresses that difficult is just another word for refusing to disappear. Bette Davis proved that a career isn't over when Hollywood says it is. It's over when you accept their verdict. She never did. The letters she wrote during those dark years show a woman who would rather be remembered for fighting than for surrendering. Lucille Ball, thank you letters that saved her career. Bette Davis proved you could come back from being written off by an industry. But what if the enemy isn't the industry? What if the enemy is your own government, armed with subpoenas and the power to destroy you? Lucille Ball had 24 hours to prepare for that moment. September 1953. Lucille Ball was at the absolute summit of American entertainment, higher than any woman in show business had ever climbed. I Love Lucy was the #1 show on television, watched by 44 million people every single week, more than 1 out of every 3 Americans. Monday nights were sacred in American homes. Families gathered around their television sets to watch her. Lucy and Desi Arnaz had revolutionized television, had invented the sitcom format that's still used today, creating a show that felt alive and immediate. They were the most powerful couple in show business. Then, on September 10th, 1953, a headline appeared in papers across the country. Lucille Ball named as communist. The story broke like a bomb. Lucy had registered as a Communist Party member in 1936, 17 years earlier. Gossip columnist Walter Winchell reported it on his Sunday night radio show, his voice dripping with implication, and panic erupted immediately. This was the height of the McCarthy era, when being labeled a communist could end careers overnight, could get you blacklisted from every studio in Hollywood. Philip Morris, the tobacco company that sponsored I Love Lucy, threatened to pull funding immediately. Network executives considered canceling the show. Lucy's career, her marriage, everything teetered on the edge of total collapse. The truth was both simple and complicated. In 1936, Lucy had been 25 years old, a struggling actress making $35 a week when she could get work, living with her grandfather, Fred Hunt, in a small apartment because she couldn't afford her own place. Her grandfather was an idealistic socialist who'd run for local office in upstate New York, a dreamer who believed in workers' rights and economic justice. He'd asked Lucy to register communist to humor him, to make him happy. She'd done it once. filled out a form to please the grandfather who'd raised her, never attended a single meeting, never believed in communism, had no idea it would matter 17 years later. But in 1953, nuance didn't matter. The House Un-American Activities Committee summoned her to testify. Her entire life would be examined, questioned. Lucy was terrified. On September 4th, she testified in a closed hearing in Los Angeles, crying as she explained about her grandfather, about being young and naive. They asked her about meetings she'd never attended. They asked if she knew communists. She sat in that hearing room wearing a simple dark dress that Desi had picked out, her hands shaking, giving answers through tears. While she waited to see if her testimony would be accepted, something remarkable happened. Letters began arriving at the Desi-Lu studio. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Every single day, mail trucks would pull up with sacks of letters, thousands upon thousands of letters from ordinary Americans defending Lucille Ball. Housewives wrote that Lucy represented American values better than any politician, that she made them laugh when their husbands were overseas during the war. Veterans wrote that she'd entertained troops during World War II through USO shows, that she'd made them laugh when they needed it most. Mothers wrote that she'd gotten them through hard times, that Monday nights watching Lucy were sacred family time. School teachers organized petition drives. One teacher in Ohio named Dorothy Mills collected 80 signatures from parents in her district and mailed them with a 3-page letter explaining that Lucy had done more for American families than any committee ever would. The letters were an act of democratic rebellion. This was the McCarthy era, when defending someone accused of communism could get you investigated too, could bring the committee's attention to you. But ordinary Americans did it anyway. They refused to be intimidated. They stood up for Lucy when she needed them most. And Lucy, even while waiting to learn if her career would survive, grabbed her pen and started writing back. She sat down late into the night after filming and responded to hundreds of letters personally. To the school teacher in Ohio who'd organized that petition, she wrote, "You believed me when senators didn't. You gave me the courage to walk back on that set and make America laugh again. I'll never forget that you stood by me when it would have been easier, safer to turn away. You risked standing up for someone they called a communist. That took more courage than anything I've ever done." The House committee accepted her testimony on September 12th. The sponsors, seeing the outpouring of support, agreed to stay. And on September 14th, 1953, just 10 days after the scandal broke, Lucy performed in front of a live studio audience for the first time since the scandal exploded. The tension backstage was unbearable. No one knew how the audience would react. Desi Arnaz, her husband and the business mind behind Desi-Lu, walked out onto the stage before the show started and addressed the audience directly. His words became legendary. "The only thing read about Lucy is her hair, and even that's not legitimate." The audience erupted in laughter and applause that went on and on. When Lucy appeared, they gave her a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Women were crying, men were cheering. The love in that room was overwhelming. The episode they filmed that night got the highest ratings in television history up to that point. 72% of all televisions in America were tuned to "I Love Lucy." America had spoken louder than any committee. They didn't care what politicians said. Lucy was theirs. The ratings spike was itself an act of defiance. Millions tuning in specifically to show the government that they decided who America's sweetheart was. Lucy worked for another 36 years after that night, until 1989. She never forgot that moment when fans saved her. In later interviews, especially in her final years, she'd tear up describing those letters, the ordinary people who'd risked defending her. She said it taught her that real America, the people, not the politicians, were fundamentally decent. The scandal passed, but the lesson remained. When institutions fail you, sometimes it's ordinary people writing letters who save your life. Lucy never took her audience for granted again. Do you see what's happening here? Every single one of these legends, Bergman, Stewart, Davis, Ball, they all did the exact same thing. When Hollywood demanded they perform perfectly, maintain their images, they grabbed pens and told the truth. When studios wanted carefully managed images, they gave strangers their humanity. The letters weren't public, they were surviving. And 2 more stars did the exact same thing. But what they revealed was something Hollywood never wanted anyone to know. Humphrey Bogart, the cynic who wrote the most honest letters in Hollywood. While Bergman was defending love, Stewart was hiding PTSD that would haunt him for decades. Davis was performing with confidence she didn't feel, and Lucy was terrified behind her smile. Humphrey Bogart was doing something no other star dared. He was telling aspiring actors not to come to Hollywood. He was talking about his failures in a town that demanded you only discuss success. Why would Hollywood's toughest guy spend hours writing letters telling people not to pursue their dreams? The answer reveals everything fake about the Dream Factory. Humphrey Bogart didn't become a leading man until he was 42 years old. Think about that. The actor who'd become synonymous with tough guy cool, who'd star in Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon, who'd define what it meant to be a Hollywood icon. He spent his entire 30s getting shot in the first reel of forgettable gangster pictures. Bogart was born to wealth in New York in 1900, the son of a surgeon father, expected to become a doctor or lawyer, to join respectable society. Throughout the 1930s, through his entire 30s, he played forgettable criminals who got eliminated by James Cagney or Edward G. Robinson in the first 20 minutes of B movies. Small parts, thankless parts, parts where he'd show up, deliver a few lines, get shot, and go home with a small paycheck. Parts he later described in letters as mostly garbage. Then in 1941, at age 42, he got cast in High Sierra as a sympathetic criminal, then got the lead in the Maltese Falcon. Suddenly, impossibly, after 20 years of rejection, Bogart became a star. Within 2 years, he was one of the biggest names in Hollywood. But he never forgot those 20 years of struggle, those decades of rejection, of being told he wasn't handsome enough, wasn't leading man material, and he never let anyone forget it either. Bogart wrote fan letters like no other Hollywood star because Bogart had zero interest in maintaining Hollywood illusions or selling the dream. Other stars would write about how wonderful the business was, how dreams came true. Bogart wrote the opposite. He wrote what he wished someone had told him when he was 25. When aspiring actors wrote asking for advice, Bogart wrote back with brutal honesty that would have gotten him fired if studios had known. To a young actor named Michael Chen, who'd written Seeking Encouragement in 1955, Bogart responded, "You want to know the secret to making it in Hollywood? There isn't one. It's luck. It's random. I got lucky at 42 after 20 years of getting shot in B movies that nobody remembers. Most of what I did was garbage. Even now, after Casablanca, half the time I'm faking it, hoping nobody notices. If you can live with disappointment, false friends, and pretending to be someone you're not for a camera, then welcome to the circus. If you can't, get out now while you still know who you are." This wasn't cruelty. This was respect. This was the deepest form of caring. Bogart refused to feed young people Hollywood fantasies that would destroy them. He'd lived the reality, and the reality was that most people who came to Hollywood got destroyed by it. If his honesty scared someone off, he figured he'd probably saved their life. Fans loved him for it. When they wrote, asking if he was really as tough as he seemed on screen, Bogart wrote back saying he was acting, that toughness was a performance. One letter to a teenage fan explained, "I play tough guys because I spent my whole life being scared. Scared I wasn't good enough. Scared I'd never make it. When you're terrified, you learn how to hide it. That's all it is. I'm just better at hiding than most people." When they asked about his Oscar for The African Queen, he wrote that he'd been shocked to win, that he still didn't really understand acting after 40 years, that half of what looked like genius on screen was just him trying not to look stupid. He wrote about his drinking, not glorifying it, but acknowledging it honestly as a problem. He'd had 3 failed marriages before Lauren Bacall, to actress Helen Menken, to Mary Phillips, to Mayo Method. In one letter, he wrote with brutal self-awareness, "We're all playing dress-up in Hollywood, pretending it's real life. Then we wonder why our marriages fall apart. You can't build a real relationship on fake foundations." Lauren Bacall later wrote extensively about Bogart's letter-writing habit in her memoirs. She said he'd spend hours at his desk, responding to fan mail, that he felt an obligation to tell people the truth because no one else in Hollywood would. Everyone else was selling the dream. He'd seen too many young people destroyed by false hope. What's remarkable is that his honesty didn't hurt his image. It enhanced it. People didn't think less of him. They respected that he wasn't feeding them lines. Young people wrote saying his warnings had helped them make better decisions. One man wrote a letter 20 years after receiving Bogart's discouraging response, writing to thank Bogart for saving him from wasting his life. The man had been about to drop out of college to move to Hollywood. Bogart's letter convinced him to stay in Chicago, become a teacher. 30 years later, he had a wife, 3 kids, and a good life. In 1956, Bogart was diagnosed with throat cancer. He was 56 years old, had smoked 3 packs a day for 40 years, and the cancer was aggressive. He faced mortality with the same blunt honesty. When fans wished him well, he wrote back acknowledging he was probably going to pass away soon. He passed away on January 14, 1957, at 2 in the morning at his home. Lauren Bacall found dozens of unsent letters in his desk. Final responses to fans, honest to the last. One letter ended with, "Whatever you do, make sure it's something you'd want to be remembered for. I made 90 movies. I'm proud of maybe 6. That's the ratio you should expect. Make peace with it or find another line of work." Bogart never pretended to be more than he was. A working actor who got lucky late, made some good films. His letters strip away the Hollywood mythology. In a town built on lies, he made truth his brand, and fans loved him for it. Now, before we get to our final story, and I'm warning you, you'll need tissues. Imagine opening your mailbox in 1953 and finding a handwritten letter from Lucille Ball thanking you for believing in her. These weren't form letters. These were real connections between legends and ordinary people. Leave a comment below telling us which of these letters moved you most, and what other Golden Age Hollywood topics should we cover next. Rita Hayworth, the last coherent letters before she forgot everything. Bogart told the truth until his final days, writing letters from his deathbed. But our last legend couldn't tell the truth because she was forgetting what truth even was, forgetting who she was. I keep looking at these photographs and I can't remember being her. Was I really Gilda? It feels like I'm watching someone else's life, like a movie I saw once but can't quite recall. They tell me that's me, and I believe them, but it doesn't feel real anymore. Was any of it real? Rita Hayworth wrote those words in late 1979 to a woman named Constance Miller she'd been writing to since 1946, 33 years of correspondence. It was the last fully coherent letter Rita would ever write. 3 months later, she'd receive a diagnosis that would explain everything: early-stage Alzheimer's condition. But before anyone understood what was happening, there were the letters. Letters that show a woman disappearing, sentence by sentence, memory by memory, until there was nothing left. Who was Rita Hayworth? During World War II, more than 5 million American soldiers carried her pin-up photo in their pockets, tucked into helmets, taped inside lockers, folded in wallets next to pictures of wives and girlfriends. Her image from the 1946 film Gilda, gloves slowly peeling off, one shoulder bare, that smoldering look over one shoulder, became the most iconic photograph of the war, more famous than any battle photo. They literally painted her picture on the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, on the side of the bomb that would obliterate a city. She represented fantasy, desire, everything men dreamed about while fighting overseas. She was the love goddess, but Rita Hayworth wasn't real. She'd never been real. Her real name was Margarita Carmen Canzino. She was a dancer from a Spanish family, with darker skin, black hair, a lower hairline. The studio, Columbia Pictures, looked at her and saw raw material for transformation. They subjected her to painful electrolysis treatments, hundreds of hours over months, to raise her hairline 2 inches, to make her forehead higher, more American. They dyed her black hair red, a specific shade that would photograph well in Technicolor. They gave her a new name, Rita Hayworth. They gave her a new identity, a new face, a new life. Margarita Carmen Canzino became Rita Hayworth, love goddess, and the real woman slowly disappeared beneath the manufactured image. For decades, Rita played the role. She danced with Fred Astaire in You'll Never Get Rich and You Were Never Lovelier. She danced with Gene Kelly in CoverGirl. She married 5 times, director Edward Judson, who was 22 years older, Orson Welles, the boy genius, Prince Ali Khan, which made her an actual princess, singer Dick Haymes, producer James Hill. She made films where men desired her and women wanted to be her. And somewhere underneath all that performance, Margarita Canzino kept getting smaller and smaller until even Rita couldn't remember who she'd been before the transformation. By the late 1970s, Rita was in her early 60s and exhibiting strange behavior that terrified everyone who knew her. She'd forget appointments, showing up hours late or on the wrong day entirely, confused about where she was supposed to be. She'd repeat the same stories in conversations, sometimes 3 or 4 times within an hour. She'd show up to events confused about where she was, why she was there. She'd forget names of people she'd known for 30 years. Tabloids blamed alcoholism. Hollywood whispered she was losing her mind from too many years of hard living. Her daughter, Yasmin Khan, suspected something much worse. Rita had been corresponding with certain fans since the 1940s. Pen pals she'd maintained through decades of marriages, divorces, career ups and downs. These women had been writing to her for 30 years, and Rita had always written back. But around 1978, these longtime correspondents started noticing changes in her letters. Small things at first. The handwriting became shakier, less controlled. Stories would be repeated in consecutive letters, as if she'd forgotten she'd already shared them just weeks before. One longtime correspondent, Constance Miller, later shared letters from this period with biographers, and they show the progressive deterioration with heartbreaking clarity. In January 1978, Rita wrote a coherent letter about her grandchildren, about her life in New York City, about memories of dancing with Fred Astaire in You Were Never Lovelier. The handwriting was neat. The thoughts were organized. It was Rita, fully present. By June of that year, just 5 months later, another letter to Constance covered the exact same topics. Her grandchildren, New York, dancing with Fred Astaire, using nearly identical phrasing, as if she'd forgotten she'd already written about these things just months before. The handwriting was shakier. By 1979, the letters showed someone slipping away into fog. Rita would start paragraphs about her career, about specific films. Then the sentences would trail off mid-thought, leaving blank space, as if she'd forgotten what she meant to say. What word came next? She'd ask her secretary who certain people were, people she'd known for decades. The handwriting became childlike, uncontrolled, letters varying wildly in size, words spelled phonetically as if she was forgetting how to write them. But scattered throughout these deteriorating letters were moments of terrible clarity, moments where Rita seemed to understand exactly what was happening to her. She'd write about looking at photographs from her films, photos of herself as Gilda, and not recognizing herself, not connecting the woman in the images to the woman looking at them. In one letter from mid-1979, her handwriting shaky but still legible, she wrote, "They show me these photos and tell me I was beautiful. I look at her and think, who is that? She doesn't feel like me. I don't remember being her. Sometimes I wonder if I ever was her, or if that was always someone else." The last fully coherent letter Rita Hayworth wrote came in late October 1979. It's preserved in biographical collections at UCLA and at the Alzheimer's Association. And it's one of the most haunting documents in Hollywood history because you can feel her slipping away even as she writes. Rita wrote, "I keep looking at these photographs and I can't remember being her. Was I really Gilda? It feels like I'm watching someone else's life, like a movie I saw once but can't quite recall. They tell me that's me, and I believe them. I do believe them, but it doesn't feel real anymore. Was any of it real? Was I ever really Rita Hayworth? Or was I always just Margarita pretending? I can't remember which one I am. Sometimes I can't remember being either of them." Think about the layers of tragedy stacked upon tragedy in those words. Rita Hayworth, whose entire identity had been manufactured by a studio, who'd buried Margarita Carmen Cancino to become a fantasy object for millions of men, was now forgetting even the manufactured identity. She couldn't remember being Rita Hayworth, the love goddess, but she also couldn't remember being Margarita, the girl from Brooklyn, the dancer. Both women were disappearing into the fog simultaneously. The real person and the fake person were both being erased, and she was aware enough to know it was happening, to understand she was losing herself, but powerless to stop it. Months after that letter, Rita received a diagnosis that changed everything: early-stage Alzheimer's condition. At the time, in 1980, most people had barely heard of Alzheimer's. It wasn't understood, wasn't talked about openly, and was often misdiagnosed. Rita Hayworth became one of the first high-profile cases to bring attention to the condition. Her daughter Yasmin became her primary caregiver and a fierce advocate for Alzheimer's awareness. Yasmin later spoke extensively about those letters from 1978 and 79, about how heartbreaking it was to see her mother's mind deteriorating on the page, visible in the handwriting and the confusion, to watch the progression from slight confusion to complete loss of self written out. Rita lived for 8 more years after diagnosis, but those years were a long goodbye, a slow erasure. Her memory erased everything, piece by piece. First, the recent past, what she'd done yesterday, what she'd eaten for breakfast. Then the distant past, her films, her marriages, her career, her fame. Then her daughter's name, then her own name. By the end, she didn't remember being Rita Hayworth. She didn't remember being Margarita Cancino. She didn't remember being anyone at all. She passed away on May 14th, 1987, at age 68. Her body simply gave out, but in a real sense, Rita Hayworth had disappeared years earlier, lost to a condition that steals everything you are, every memory, every relationship, every thought, before it finally takes your life. The cruelty is multi-layered and almost unbearable. First, she'd spent her entire career being whoever men wanted her to be. Margarita transformed into Rita. The real woman is buried beneath the fantasy, beneath the makeup and the hair dye. She'd been objectified, controlled, turned into an image rather than a person, into a product rather than a human being. Studios had taken a real human being and manufactured her into an object of desire, erasing her actual identity. And then, in a final cosmic irony, even that manufactured image was stripped away. The condition that took her mind was utterly democratic. It didn't care that she'd been beautiful, famous, desired by millions. It didn't care that 5 million soldiers had carried her picture. It took her anyway. It took Rita Hayworth, and it took Margarita Cancino. And by the end, there was no one left, just a body without memory. But those final coherent letters reveal something studios had tried to hide for decades. Rita Hayworth had always been a real person underneath the manufactured fantasy. She wasn't just an image, just a pinup. She had thoughts, feelings, fears, awareness, humanity. She understood, at least toward the end, before the condition took even that understanding, that Rita Hayworth had never been entirely real, that she'd been playing a role her entire adult life, that somewhere along the way, she'd lost track of where Margarita ended and Rita began. And when the curtain finally came down, she faced it with a heartbreaking honesty. She admitted she couldn't remember who she was. She asked if any of it had been real, and nobody could give her an answer because the question itself was unanswerable. Yasmin Khan dedicated the rest of her life to Alzheimer's advocacy after her mother passed away. She used Rita's fame to bring attention to a condition that had been hidden, shameful, misunderstood. Because of Rita's case, because Yasmin refused to hide her mother's suffering, millions of families dealing with Alzheimer's got validation. Research funding increased dramatically. The conversation changed from shame to openness. Rita Hayworth spent her career being whoever men wanted her to be. Gilda, the pinup, the love goddess, the fantasy. In the end, the cruelest irony was that she couldn't be anyone at all, not even herself, not even the manufactured version. But in those final coherent letters, in those last moments of clarity, we hear the real woman, confused, scared, aware that she's slipping away into nothing, asking questions that have no answers, and heartbreakingly, devastatingly human. These 6 legends were written by strangers because sometimes strangers are the only ones who let you tell the truth. Ingrid Bergman could confess her defiance when America wanted her repentance. James Stewart could admit his fear when the military needed his courage. Bette Davis could express her fury when Hollywood demanded silence. Lucille Ball could thank the ordinary Americans who saved her when politicians tried to destroy her. Humphrey Bogart could strip away illusions when the studio system demanded he maintain them. And Rita Hayworth could acknowledge her disappearing self when everyone around her needed her to be fine. The letters these stars wrote weren't publicity. They weren't calculated image management approved by teams of lawyers. They were acts of radical honesty in an industry built on manufactured personas, built on beautiful lies. They grabbed pens and told the truth, because sometimes the only way to stay human in Hollywood was to connect with people who saw you as human first, star second. People who didn't need you to be perfect or immortal. People who just needed you to be real. If these letters remind you why Golden Age Hollywood will never be matched, why we'll never see another era like this, share this with someone who remembers when stars were more than images. They were real people who wrote back. Hit that like button and subscribe, because we're bringing you more stories from Hollywood's golden era. The truths that never made it into the studio-approved biographies. The secrets that got written in letters to strangers and saved for decades by people who understood they were precious. These weren't just celebrities. They weren't just famous faces. They were people carrying tremendous burdens: scandal, war, aging, persecution, honesty, and finally, the ultimate loss of self. And they handled those burdens by writing to strangers who offered them something Hollywood never could: the freedom to be real, the freedom to be human, the freedom to tell the truth. That's why we'll never see another era like this. Stars today have social media where they can reach millions instantly. They have carefully curated images managed by teams. They have lawyers screening every word. These 6 legends had fountain pens, paper, postage stamps, and the courage to tell strangers the truth, to show strangers their humanity. That's not just Hollywood history preserved in dusty letters. That's human connection at its most powerful, most pure. And that's why, decades later, we're still reading their words, still moved by their honesty, still grateful they took the time to write back, to tell us who they really were beneath the lights and the costumes and the scripts. They gave us something more valuable than movies. They gave us the truth. And in an industry built on beautiful lies, that truth is the most beautiful thing of all. Until next time, this is the Golden Age Files. Thank you for watching.